I had always dreamed of having my own home. More precisely, I dreamed of a place where I could wake up feeling that everything I had once hoped for was now with me. At 30 years old, I finally felt that sense. A cozy country cottage where every corner was filled with hope for the future had become mine. It wasn't a palace, but to me it was everything. The result of several years of work and effort I had put in to build something for myself. I was proud of it. David, my husband, had always been there. We met back in university, and then, going through both hardships and joys together, we became not just spouses, but best friends. He was my rock, the one who supported me during difficult moments. I trusted him and was sure that our relationship would only grow stronger. We furnished the house together. Every choice of furniture and decor was made carefully. It was something personal, because we planned to live in this house for many years. We had dreamed of such a place for so long, and now it was ours. I remember one evening when David and I were sitting on the terrace, he looked at me and said, "Now we have our own little corner, and it's the best place in the world." His eyes sparkled with joy, and it seemed to me that our marriage, just like this house, would be protected from any storm. But still, something inside me had changed. I couldn't exactly say when or how it happened, but something told me that the perfect picture I had worked so hard to create might now be a little different. When we first started settling into the house, I realized that we needed to tidy up the garden. The task didn't seem difficult, but I knew that we couldn't do it without a professional. That's when I hired the gardener, Andrew. He was a young, energetic guy, full of enthusiasm, who seemed ready to transform any space if it was needed. At first, I didn't pay much attention to him. He worked like any good gardener, and he spoke politely and reservedly, often with David, who was dealing with other things around the house. But one day, I noticed that his gaze lingered on me longer than it should have. It was something subtle, yet noticeable. I wasn't sure if it meant anything, yet I still felt a strange flutter inside when our eyes met. Maybe it was just the excitement of a new beginning, or maybe it was Andrew, making me feel that I was still attractive. He was always polite, but sometimes his words and looks had a hint of something more. His interest in me was so subtle that I could barely grasp it. It seemed to me that he looked at me with respect, but at the same time, with a kind of light, almost imperceptible fondness. I didn't know how to respond to this, so I decided to simply not pay attention to it. Andrew was a gardener, and I was a wife. I had my own life, and my relationship with David seemed stable, though not as passionate as it once was. However, the inner discomfort from starting to notice these little gestures and glances never left me. Sometimes, for brief moments, I began to wonder if there was something more in those looks than just professionalism. One evening, when David had gone out on business, I suggested to Andrew that he stay and help me with the garden. It was already dark, and I didn't want to be alone in this new house, full of empty corners and echoes of past days. He agreed, and we began working. We talked for a long time about life, how he got into this profession, and his plans for the future. I was surprised at how easy and natural he was to talk to, as if we had known each other for many years. It was pleasant to speak with him, because unlike David, he listened attentively and always kept the conversation going. When the work was finished, we sat on the terrace, tired but content. He looked at me, smiled, and suddenly said, "You know, you're much more beautiful than I thought at first." I was taken aback. I can't say I was completely stunned by the compliment, but I definitely felt my cheeks flush slightly. I thanked him, trying to hide my embarrassment. Those words seemed simple, but there was something in them sincere. I couldn't help but feel that they came not just from a professional, but from a man who truly admired me. It was a strange and unusual feeling. Not that I had been stuck in his memory, but perhaps it reminded me that I could still be attractive. Lately, I had often forgotten about that, focused on worries and everyday matters. I looked at Andrew again, and his eyes met mine. And in that moment, I felt something inside me stir slightly. Maybe it was just a compliment, a coincidence, or a moment of weakness, but it seemed to me that I heard something more in his words than just politeness. After that evening with the compliment, when I felt somewhat vulnerable, my relationship with Andrew began to change. With each of his visits, it became harder to ignore how he sought contact with me. At first, it seemed innocent. Work-related moments, a few words about plants, or how best to arrange the garden. But with each passing day, our conversations became more and more personal. He started showing up at work in a more relaxed manner, without the hustle and hesitation, as if we already had something more than just a professional relationship. He told me about his hobbies, interests, and shared his life story. And I listened, becoming more and more captivated by his sincerity and ease of communication. He didn't hide his emotions, and that was probably one of the main differences between him and David. David had always been reserved, serious, and focused on work. Recently, a gap had formed between us, a gap that was hard to ignore. Andrew, however, seemed to know how to fill that emptiness. He listened to me with genuine interest, asked questions, and was attentive to my feelings. Even the small things I told him seemed important to him. In his eyes, I saw sincere attention, and in his words, understanding. It seemed that he didn't even realize how his simple questions about how my day had gone filled me with a sense of significance. It was so simple, and yet so important to me. Every time we talked, I wished it could last longer. Andrew had a way of keeping the conversation going so that I felt needed, valued, and most importantly, seen. With each new conversation, I became more dependent on this attention. I wasn't looking for validation or approval, but it was important to me that someone saw me, the real me. And this attention, which I hadn't received from David in so long, became the bridge that began connecting me to Andrew. I didn't realize it at first, but he gradually filled the space that had been left empty when David and I began drifting apart. We started spending more time together, talking not only about gardening. Sometimes he would come just to help me with some household task, and I could feel that an invisible connection was growing between us. It was something more than just assistance, and I enjoyed the feeling of his presence. He would laugh, joke, and sometimes I would catch myself thinking that I hadn't laughed like that with David in a long time. This moment of ease and understanding I found with Andrew became a small comfort from the daily worries. I understood that something was changing, but I couldn't stop. All these conversations, smiles, and moments in the shadow of the evening light were creating an invisible atmosphere that was consuming me. I knew that David might notice how my behavior had changed. He started asking questions that never came up in our relationship before, but I always tried to distract him, brushing off his suspicions. I didn't want to think about what was happening between me and Andrew. At some point, I even began to feel like I didn't want to think about it. It had become not just a habit, but something I was trying to hide, no matter how much I tried to explain it to myself. I increasingly felt how the harmony between David and me was slipping away, how his absences, his immersion in work were becoming more and more noticeable. Andrew, on the other hand, gave me not so much fulfillment, but rather the response I had been missing for so long. And I couldn't stop, even though I knew that each new step in that direction could be a mistake. But in that moment, it seemed to me that all of it was so insignificant. Small steps, by which I was unconsciously climbing, forgetting about the consequences. One evening, when David was once again staying late at work, I suggested to Andrew that he stay for a cup of tea. He was on our property, as usual, helping me with some small tasks, and I, feeling tired and a bit lost, invited him inside. It seemed like something completely ordinary, but as often happens, the simplest moments can turn out to be turning points in life. We sat in the living room, and I noticed how comfortable it felt with him. Andrew was always so calm and relaxed. His presence filled the room with warmth, and the conversations, which I eagerly took part in, became something I looked forward to every day. He told me about his life, about what he liked about this place and what he valued in relationships. There was no hint of falseness, no unnecessary emotions in his words. He spoke as he thought, and that attracted me. I couldn't help but notice how his gaze sometimes lingered on me. It wasn't anything overt, but it was noticeable. He seemed to be searching for something in my eyes, in my face, as if he wanted to understand who I truly was. We exchanged glances, and each time it felt like a small discovery, as if he saw something in me that I sometimes didn't even notice myself. I liked it. It was pleasant, but at the same time, I felt how it was tearing at my conscience. After we had talked for a while, Andrew started to get ready to leave. I stood up to see him off, but he suddenly stopped. He looked at me in a way that made me feel his gaze penetrate deep within me. There was something in his silence that made me freeze. He walked toward me and said, "You know, you're truly unique. I didn't think people like you existed." I didn't know how to respond. It was such a strange compliment, but there was nothing vulgar about it. It carried something much deeper. And I felt my own feelings beginning to outweigh everything else, as if they were breaking free, not knowing how to stay within the boundaries of what was safe. And in that moment, when I slightly leaned forward to reply or say something, something inside me seemed to snap. We looked at each other, and suddenly I realized I couldn't stop anymore. And in the next instant, our lips met. I felt a mixture of emotions, embarrassment and guilt, but along with that, an incredible sensation that this wasn't just spontaneous, but something that needed to happen. After the kiss, I stood in the room, and Andrew seemed not to know what to say. We both remained silent, unsure of how to move forward. It wasn't so much a mistake as it was a moment of weakness. And perhaps I wanted everything to remain just that, an isolated moment, without leaving any lasting traces. But I knew it wouldn't be that easy to forget. My thoughts were mixed with emotions, and the responsibility for that moment overwhelmed me entirely. I didn't know how to go on, how to explain to myself what had just happened. And yet, it was a moment that changed everything. After that kiss, the world seemed to have changed. It became more fragile, blurry, and each day brought new doubts and questions. I tried to justify myself, convincing myself that it was just a mistake, a moment of weakness. However, no matter what I told myself, the reality was different. That kiss was not just a coincidence. It left a mark I couldn't erase. Each time I met Andrew, the feeling of guilt and responsibility grew stronger. His gaze, his silence, his presence. It was as if something invisible was calling me, an unknown force. I didn't know how to behave, and it seemed like the world around me was shifting. He was there, always ready to listen and support, and it was becoming harder and harder to ignore what was happening between us. I started to worry that my relationship with David was beginning to crumble, like a house of cards. We were becoming strangers to each other, even though everything seemed the same on the outside. David continued to be who he was, but I felt like I was drifting farther away from him each day. This feeling didn't leave me for a moment. I tried to maintain normal relations, avoiding open conflict, but inside, I was no longer the person I used to be. I couldn't fully be with David anymore, because in my mind, that moment with Andrew, that kiss, echoed. And it had changed everything. It had become something forbidden and yet irresistibly pulling. I tried to bring everything back to normal, but every time Andrew was near, my thoughts drifted far away from what I wanted to return to. I couldn't stop thinking about him, and it was becoming more and more tormenting. I didn't know how to find a way out of this situation. The guilt over my betrayal wouldn't release me. When I tried to talk to David, to explain my feelings, I couldn't find the right words. I felt that he was starting to notice my detachment, though he couldn't understand why. I didn't know what to say to him because I couldn't confess what had been happening. And yet, this burden in my heart continued to grow. Inside, anxiety was spinning, becoming more and more oppressive. I felt the world I had built for so long falling apart. The fear of losing David mixed with guilt, but at the same time, it was becoming hard to resist what was happening between me and Andrew. It was like balancing on the edge of a cliff, not knowing whether to step forward or step back. But each time I thought I could restore everything, each time I tried to bring back normalcy, that moment returned to my mind. And I knew that I could never walk away from it as easily as I had before. One evening, when David came home earlier than usual, I already felt that something was wrong. He was always busy with work, and normally I wouldn't have been worried. But at that moment, my heart was pounding in my chest. We had just started our usual conversation in the living room with Andrew, and it seemed like I couldn't shake the feeling that everything I had been hiding was about to be exposed. When the door opened, I stood up, but somehow too suddenly, too strongly. David, standing in the doorway, caught me at the moment when I was trying to hide the traces of my recent interaction with Andrew. He looked at me, and his gaze was full of questions. I froze. It was that moment when everything I had been trying to conceal became too obvious. He was silent, but in his eyes was worry. I knew what he was feeling. He had already suspected something was wrong, but couldn't understand exactly what. David stepped into the room, and the air became heavy. My gaze drifted to him, and I realized that the silence had become all-encompassing. He stood before me with an expression I couldn't recognize. It wasn't just surprise or disappointment. It was something deeper. It was shock. "What's going on?" he asked, and I couldn't find the words. My silence was louder than any answer I could have given. I felt a lump growing in my chest, as if the whole world was collapsing around me and I couldn't break free from it. My eyes darted around the room, trying to find the right words, but they were nowhere to be found. In that moment, I realized that everything I had built was crumbling right before my eyes. David continued to look at me, and I felt that he was waiting for me to say something. But what could I say? How could I explain what I couldn't even explain to myself? Andrew's gaze, the kiss that had happened that evening when I couldn't resist, it had all become an invisible weight on my shoulders. I tried to justify my actions, but all the words I spoke sounded empty and unconvincing. All I could do was remain silent, and that silence became the loudest thing happening. He asked again, quietly and with pain in his voice, "Why are you doing this with me?" I couldn't answer. I couldn't meet his gaze because I knew that now everything was visible. All the hidden feelings, doubts, guilt, and fears that I had tried to keep inside were now exposed. And in that moment, I realized that I could no longer regain the trust that had been built so carefully and slowly in our relationship. It was shattered, and I didn't even know if it could be rebuilt. After that evening, everything changed. David didn't say a word to me right away, but his silence became louder than any words. He just withdrew into himself, as if his own heart was closing off from me, not knowing how to deal with what I had destroyed. The next day, I noticed how he had changed. He was no longer the person with whom I once laughed and shared my dreams. He was cold, distant, and his silence left an emptiness in the house that seemed unbearable. All my attempts to explain, to have an honest conversation, ended with me being unable to find the right words. I tried to say that I hadn't wanted this, that I had mistakenly fallen in love with someone who shouldn't have been a part of my life. But even I didn't believe that. Every word I spoke seemed to tear apart before it reached his heart. He just remained silent, his eyes full of pain, watching me as if searching for answers to questions I couldn't give. David started avoiding communication. He threw himself into his work, focusing on what had always brought him comfort, but all of it seemed so shallow. I couldn't help but notice how his gaze had become cold and detached. He was there, but I felt his soul was now far away. He began asking questions, but they were the kind to which I couldn't give honest answers. He asked what was wrong, what was happening, but every time I tried to explain something, I could feel him hurting even more. In his silence, I heard only one thing. He no longer trusted me. And no matter how much I tried to justify myself, no matter how much I tried to say I hadn't wanted this, I knew I couldn't bring anything back. Our life together seemed unnatural, as if someone had replaced us. I felt like everything we had was in the past now, and it wasn't even clear if it could ever be restored. Andrew disappeared. I no longer saw him. He vanished as if he had dissolved into the air, leaving behind only a shadow of what had been between us. His departure didn't bring relief. Instead, it left me alone with my guilt. I could no longer hide that I wasn't just guilty toward David, but also toward myself. I had lost a part of myself, the part that had always believed in sincerity and trust. Each day grew heavier. I could look at David, but I could no longer understand what he was feeling. His silence was like a wall I couldn't break through. I knew he was drifting further away, but I couldn't find a way to bring him back. It was as if we were stuck in the emptiness between us, and I couldn't offer anything to fix the situation. There were only words, but they couldn't repair what had already been broken. Several weeks passed in this painful silence. I tried to think of something I could do to fix at least part of what I had destroyed. But the days dragged on, and I couldn't help but feel how our life together was slowly fading. He was no longer the person with whom I could talk about my feelings, my worries. He had become a stranger to me, and I to him. With each passing day, it became harder to find the words to express my regrets. I knew we needed to decide something, or everything would fade into nothingness. One day, sitting in silence in the kitchen, I made a decision. I could no longer keep going like this, hoping everything would somehow fix itself. I could no longer hide my guilt, my pain. I had to confess, not only to him, but to myself. I loved him. But love could not exist without trust, and trust was something I had destroyed. I understood that now, if I wanted to regain even a little of what we had, I needed to start with honesty. I could no longer allow myself to live in this closed circle, building illusions and hiding the truth. When David came home that evening, I already knew I had to talk to him. I couldn't put off this conversation any longer. I found the strength to look him in the eye and say what had needed to be said for a long time. I was wrong. I ruined everything we had. I am to blame. And I don't know what to do to fix this, but I want to try. In his eyes, there was no anger, as I had expected. There was just emptiness, a look that couldn't hide anything from me anymore. He was silent, and I could feel how the air between us was becoming heavier. "You don't trust me," he said quietly, as though trying to find in these words an explanation for everything that had happened. I nodded. "I lost your trust, and I don't know how to get it back." He was silent for a long time, and I stood there, waiting for him to speak, for him to do something. There was no judgment in his eyes, only weariness. But it was then that I realized that admitting my mistake wasn't the end. It was the first step on the path to recovery, a path that might be long and difficult, but I was ready to take it. "I can't just forget what happened," he said, "but I'm willing to think about what we can do to fix it." This was the first sign of hope I had seen in a long time. I understood that David might never be the same as he was before, but it was also the beginning of what I could do to regain at least some of the trust that had been lost. We were both willing to work, and that gave me at least some hope that maybe not everything was lost. We decided to give each other time. I didn't ask for his forgiveness because I knew it couldn't be given so easily. I suggested we be honest, work on ourselves and our relationship, and rebuild what we had both lost. I chose the path that required not only admissions but also actions. And although I understood that the road ahead would be long, I could no longer allow myself to be the person who hides the truth. I could only be honest, work on myself, and hope that, if David was willing to fight for us, we could find a way. And even if the future was uncertain, I knew one thing. I had already taken a step in the right direction. Several weeks passed, and life didn't become easier right away. Rebuilding trust is a process that can't be resolved with just one conversation. It requires time, effort, and most importantly, a willingness from both sides to move forward despite all the difficulties. David became more open with me, but I felt that there was still a distance between us that needed to be crossed. It wasn't as easy as I had imagined. But at least now I could look him in the eyes without feeling the shame tearing me apart inside. David started paying more attention to me. We began spending time together again, going for walks, talking about the future. It wasn't easy. We couldn't go back to what we had before, but gradually we started building something new. I realized that I couldn't just ask him to forgive me and expect everything to fall into place right away. It was a long road. A road that started with small things, with honesty, with conversations, with simply being there for each other, supporting each other in moments of weakness. Each day became a step toward recovery. Sometimes it was hard. And occasionally, David and I lost our patience and argued, but I always remembered that these moments were the very building blocks that would help us restore our marriage. I knew that things would be different now. I couldn't just forget what happened, but I was learning to forgive myself. And this process of forgiveness was exactly what I had been searching for when I tried to find my way back to David. I was learning to trust him again and be honest with myself. I thought a lot about what had happened and how important those moments had been when I could have said, stop. When I could have stopped myself before my actions led to consequences that couldn't be undone. Several months later, we became a little closer. Our relationship was becoming more open, more genuine. We had learned to look at each other in a new way, to listen and understand how important it is to appreciate what you have. I realized that everything I had lost could be regained, but only through honesty, through hard work on myself and on our future. I can't say everything became perfect. That's impossible. But I knew one thing. I was ready to fight to keep what we had. David and I began building our new start, and though I understood that it wouldn't be easy, I was ready to continue. Andrew disappeared from our lives, but the lesson he taught me remained. He reminded me of the importance of not forgetting those who are close to you, not losing connection and trust, and that a moment of weakness can lead to consequences that cannot be undone unless you work through them. I learned to appreciate the stability and reliability that David gave me, and I understood how important it is to be honest and open in relationships. I didn't know what awaited us in the future, but now I could walk this path with a clear understanding that every step is a chance for a new beginning. Several months passed, and with each day, I felt our life with David beginning to find new meaning. It wasn't the perfect world I had once imagined. There was no ideal, and I no longer sought it. I realized that relationships aren't about finding flawless happiness, but about learning to be honest, respecting each other, and working on oneself. David and I began to feel like we were rediscovering each other. We started to openly discuss what worried us, what we felt, and what we needed. It was a process that required patience, but it also brought a lot of joy. We no longer ran from our problems. We tried to solve them together. And though sometimes it was difficult, I understood that even moments of disappointment or doubt became part of the path we had chosen. I no longer worried that we wouldn't be able to return to our previous relationship. I no longer strived for everything to be as it was before. Instead, I learned to appreciate the reality we were creating together, step by step. We had our own unique dynamic, and despite all the trials, it was only growing stronger. David became much more open. He no longer withdrew into himself, and I, in turn, learned to trust him again. I realized that it's not only important to trust the other person, but also to trust yourself. And this was the moment when I finally understood that the true strength of a relationship lies in the ability to be sincere and open, despite what happened in the past. A few weeks ago, David and I sat on the porch of our house looking at the garden, which was now as much a symbol of change as our relationship. "I'm proud of what we've been able to get through," he said, and there was sincerity in his voice. I nodded because I knew we both felt proud of it. We had faced difficulties and made them part of our growth. I was ready to continue. We both were. Andrew remained in the past, and I understood that the lesson he had taught me was important, but not defining. He became part of the story, not my life. I was ready to move forward and, most importantly, together with David. We were both learning to appreciate each other anew, and despite all the mistakes and missed moments, I knew we had a future. We were starting to build it without looking back. It was difficult, but it was an incredibly important beginning, and I couldn't have missed it.